Hello, everyone. I'm going to introduce you to our lecture on ancient China, which is going to be Chapter 5. And this will be online, so you can look at it over the next couple of days before we have our test on Friday. Okay? So, ancient China. The thing about China in the ancient world is that China is the superpower of the ancient world. It is always bigger than everyone else. It's always wealthier than everyone else. It always has more people than everyone else. It's really in another league. Especially in some periods of history that we'll talk about China as far as population and progress and technology. It's in a different world. And so studying China in the ancient world is significant because it is where most things happen. What's ironic about the history of China is that it is an isolated country for much of the ancient world, right, before the Silk Road gets going. And the rule usually in history is if someone is isolated, then they don't progress as fast as other civilizations. We have plenty of examples of this. However, China is the exception to that rule. China is very isolated. They're very far removed from the other civilizations we have studied by geographic barriers such as the Himalayas and large deserts, as well as just by distance. And these Chinese kings were able to grow and flourish faster than everyone else, even in their isolation. And when we talk about the Chinese River Valley, we will eventually talk about two rivers, but it is not like Mesopotamia, where you have two rivers that are very close together. In a way, it's more like the Indus River Valley and the Ganges River Valley, where you have two rivers that are separated, and so you talk about one story and then another story, and eventually those two stories connect. And that's what we have in China. So the first river we'll talk about is the Yellow River, the Huanghe River. And again, to the Chinese students, I apologize for my lack of pronunciation. But the Huanghe, we will call it the Yellow River, spans the northern part of China. It goes from central China and flows into what many maps call the East Sea, right? And so here's a map of it here, the Yellow River. The reason why it is the Yellow River, because the silt that floods over the banks and is left is yellow, and of course it causes the water to be yellow so many times. The color is the name. Much of the sand comes from the Taklamakan Desert. It blows over into the river, it sinks to the bottom, and then floods over onto the banks, and that's where many of the early Chinese farmers were able to plant their crops. We're talking maybe around 6,000, 7,000 BC. China was settled very early on by nomadic peoples, and even earlier than the Homo sapiens, we have evidence of early hominids that lived in this area. The farming begins around 5,000, and eventually you start to have these smaller kingdoms that exist along the Yellow River here, okay? So in northern China. Now, Beijing, as you can see, is the modern capital that's there. Of course, that wasn't there at the time, but it gives you kind of a reference to where this is on the map. So Beijing is there, and the Yellow River is there. Okay? Now, so the dawn of the Chinese civilization, early civilization along the Yangtze rivers, it even looks a little yellow in that photo, doesn't it, right? It's 12% of the land is arable, but it's important to geography, isolation, and invasion. We talked about Egypt, for example. Egypt was isolated from invasion because of the large deserts. Well, we ask ourselves, what isolates China? Well, large mountain ranges like the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, they isolate China, as well as large deserts like the Taklamakan Desert and the Tibetan or the desert of the Gobi Desert. They isolate China, right? And so China was able to grow kind of insulated unto itself. And with large rivers and flooding, you were able to farm. However, like other river valleys, China's river flow and river flooding were very unpredictable. And so a lot of times the Yellow River in ancient China is called China's sorrow, because after it would flood its banks, it would destroy. Too much flooding, of course, would destroy crops and homes and cause thousands of lives. And so, like other river valleys, this is the issue that the Chinese people had. All right, so very early on, we have a couple of different dynasties. The first dynasty is the Xia. The Xia is an interesting thing about the Chinese dynasties, especially in our conversations that we've had, is when we talked about the idea of a river valley and how you have a problem and you solve that problem. You have an irrigation problem, and someone organizes workers to build dams or dig canals, and that person is kind of the early engineer that figures all this out by trial and error and is able to make the water flow to the crops in just the right amount so that they'll grow. And he is the first leader of society, the idea of the engineer, right? Well, the Xia dynasty, the oldest of the Chinese dynasties, had just a leader. The legend says, and this is so old that we don't really know a lot about it. It's more legend than fact at this point. But the legend is of King Yu, and King Yu is not necessarily a religious figure or a military figure. He's more of an engineer, and he figured out how to dig the right canals and places, and were able to water the crops in just the right amount to support a large civilization that would become the Xia dynasty, spelled as an X-I-A and pronounced as Xia, right? And so this is Emperor Yu. And again, a legend. We're not really quite sure. The next dynasty that would surpass and eventually, I think, envelop or conquer the Xia dynasty would be the Shang. And the Shang we know about because the Shang had writing, and the Shang would write about the Xia, and so that's some of the information we have about the Xia dynasty. But there's information about the Shang, right? So the Shang dynasty is Chinese civilization who began around 4,000 years ago. So after the Xia, in the midst of time, we reached the Shang, which we can set a date at 4,000 years ago, right? And it's the second dynasty, it's the Shang dynasty around the 16th century BCE. Now, if you look at our map here, the purple represents the Xia. So very early on, you have the larger or the smaller dynasties. And then in the green, you will have the Shang dynasty, which again envelops the Xia and eventually will conquer it. And then finally, the third dynasty we'll talk about in this chapter is the Orange dynasty, and that would be the Zhou, right? The Z-H-O-U. So like Mesopotamia, every kingdom that develops in China is a little larger than the last, and bigger until we get to the Qin, which won't be this chapter, okay? All right, so there were an agricultural society. Chinese people grew an early form of millet, which is a type of grain, not rice yet, right? They're growing millet. That grain would make bread, and that would support larger populations in the Yellow River Valley. They had a central bureaucracy, which included a government, a strong king. China was a very patriarchal society, and so patriarchal society in that the family unit was very important. The idea, and we'll talk more about this when we get to Confucianism in our next chapter, but the idea of the male being the head of the family, whether it be the father or the grandfather or the oldest son, he was in charge and given much responsibility, but also much respect. And in the same way, on a national level, China was governed as a national family, where the emperor served as the father of the nation, and he had lots of responsibility, but also was given lots of respect, right? And so you had a strong central government under these early kingdoms that would rule from top down, kind of like a pyramid type structure, right? Again, but you would also have class systems develop, like we saw in other river valley civilizations. The king would be on top, but he also would be supported by advisors, military men, and they would be the aristocratic or noble class. Underneath them, you would have traders and merchants, and the Chinese mostly were trading with each other at this time. And so, but they were very powerful people that moved goods back and forth. Skilled workers were also very important in this society, as well as the farmer, which, of course, ended up on the bottom. And so we start to have a stratified society in China pretty early on with different classes. With large armies, they began to use chariots. By the end of our Egyptian discussion, we talked about how the Hyksos brought chariots into Egypt and conquered Egypt, but then the Egyptians would master those chariots and kick the Hyksos out. Well, China began using chariots pretty early on. And the use of bronze weapons as well, early on in the Shang dynasty. And also, as we talked about in our discussion last time, with China, there is no high class of priests that are equal to the king or over the king. The king is the high priest. And so, like the Pharaoh in Egypt, we have this emperor of China who is, as we discussed, the son of heaven. And in that son of heaven, he became the radio, the conduit, the intermediary between the spiritual world and the physical world. So his responsibilities were physical, whereas he was the protector and the warrior, but he was also the priest, so he got spiritual responsibilities as well, right? And so that gave him great power in both realms, the spiritual and the physical world. Now, looking at the works of art here, we have clues as to how Chinese society is developing. These are bronze figures of a vase or a cup, as well as a pouring vessel, and these were used by the elite class. They were created and used for the elite class in rituals, religious rituals, socializing, things like that. And so we have very early metal smithing or smelting of bronze and the using of bronze in Chinese society. And that's going to be one of those things that happened in China before they happen in other places, and just makes China more advanced. All right, political structures and social structures continued. Originally, before we have like large empires in China or large dynasties, you have clans, and clans, of course, are family units. They are large family units, and again, the family will become the core of Chinese society, the most important part. And so, clans. So we see clans with common names. Then we start to see class differentiation between aristocrats and, as we said, merchants and peasants, farmers, and then below them you also have slaves. And then the mastery of bronze casting, like we saw in the last pictures, as well as this picture. Most of these vessels were ritual vessels, like we said, used in religious rituals and stuff. And that's explained the carvings around it and everything. And they begin to develop a sophisticated writing system. Now, the writing system in China began as an oracle or a fortune-telling device, right? You would create symbols, and those symbols would be an idea of something, right? When we talk about Chinese script, Chinese script is not a phonic alphabet; it's a symbol alphabet. Whereas instead of having a letter that has a sound, you have a letter that means house, or a letter that means person or human or boy, girl, whatever. You'd have that letter, and so and that was the way these symbols developed in the oracle or the fortune-telling tradition. All right, so here we have an example of this, a prime example of this type of fortune-telling that would eventually become the Chinese writing system. This, if you can tell, is the bottom of a turtle shell, okay? And what was believed in ancient Chinese society is that, of course, the turtle shell has different geometric shapes on the top and the bottom. And what many oracle or fortune tellers would do is they would take the turtle shell, they would write the symbols on the turtle shells in different areas of the geometric shapes. They would heat that shell over a fire and see how the shell would crack. And if the crack reached certain symbols, that would mean something about the year ahead. Something, you would tell the future fortune or misfortune or whatever by reading the turtle shell. Now, this was done in large areas in the kingdoms to see if the crops would go correctly, and it was done in small venues like matchmaking to see if this girl and this boy were a good match. It was done on turtle shells. It was also done on chicken bones. They would take the small chicken bones and carve symbols in the chicken bones and cast them like dice, and then read the chicken bones to see if the future was good or bad. Right? Now, one of the things about Chinese society, let's go ahead and get into this, is the idea that the spirits are always with you. And again, they're just not looking for luck to see if the bones will tell you the right thing or the turtle shell will tell you the right thing. The spirits are guiding these decisions, right? And it's the spirits of the gods, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's also the spirits of the ancestors, because clan was so important in China during this period of time that the idea of your living ancestors were important, but the idea of your dead ancestors held equal importance. So if you had the grandfather who had passed, his spirit still lived around the family and would bring fortune to the family if the living members of the family followed Chinese law, Chinese social rules, right? If the family went away from Chinese social rules and bad luck happened to the family, then oftentimes they would say that they have been cursed by their ancestors because they are not bringing honor to the family. So ancestor worship, very big in ancient China and follows Chinese society, even up until this day, really. Okay, so the oracle bones of the turtle that will eventually become the Chinese writing system. Okay, we'll talk about that again later on. Now, after the Shang Dynasty was more of a military dynasty. It had large cities like the capital city of Anyang, which had huge timber walls around it. The story of the walls of Anyang was that they were wide enough at the top, at like a two-lane road where chariots could ride back and forth, along the top of the wall. But eventually the Shang Dynasty would be eclipsed by the Zhou Dynasty, which was an even bigger, more militaristic society. But during the Zhou Dynasty, they were conquerors, and therefore they advanced military technology, and we'll talk about that. But they also advanced trade and other things as well. So we saw the size of the Zhou Dynasty had spread out, and therefore contacted other groups of clans in China and absorbed them into their kingdom. So we have your political structures. The king ran the central government with a large bureaucracy of ministers. One of the things about China that we learned early on is the population is bigger and it grows faster than other places in the world. And when you have a king that rules over large areas, he can't do it by himself. And so early on, what we see is the development of levels of government, right? The king delegates authority to these ministers who delegate authority to these ministers all the way down to the local level. And that type of government, as we still call it today, is called a bureaucracy. So a bureaucratic, many-leveled government developed very early in China and continued to develop over the period of the dynastic time up until the 20th century, right? So the bureaucracies, who were these officials? These officials were military generals and officers. They were relatives. Later on, that would change significantly, but at this point, it is kind of a favor from the king to the person to be a high-ranking government official, right? Principalities government were appointed by officials, right? And so the officials would appoint lower people who were appointed lower people, and of course, the king was over all of this, yes? Now, what we're seeing here on the screen are early examples of coins. And we've had like earlier questions on quizzes and stuff about the idea of coins. Coins begin in China very early on. And so we see the coins, the coin on the left is produced about 579 AD and the Northern Zhou period. The 4 characters on the coin are read from top to bottom, from left to right. They are the phrase Yang Tong Wang Go, which roughly translates as useful everywhere under heaven. And this was the point of the idea of currency, is that you could carry it, and with the more powerful the kingdom, the more valuable the coin, right? They could trade it with distant cities and towns, and they would be recognized as a valuable tender. Here we have the shape of the coin in the Eastern Zhou, which is not a circle, right, as we're used to coins today. Here we have the circle, but the circle has a hole in it. And if you didn't know, that's the way the Chinese merchants would carry it, not in their pocket, but on a string. So they would take the coins and they would thread them through the string, through that hole, and tie a knot at the end of the string, and that would be the money. And then they might put them in a pouch, but they would just drag it out, and they would have all the coins together. They would untie it and just take the coins out they want, and then tie it back. So it was an easy way to carry coinage in ancient China. All right, so let's talk about religion for a little bit. And like many early societies, China was a polytheistic society. But unlike a lot of societies that we studied, China, I need to put this, it wasn't necessarily like just elemental, like this is the god of rain, this is the god of sun, and they did have that. But what we're talking about is the idea and the search for balance, how to maintain harmony and peace within your life and within the universe. And these values, not the idea of the god of the east wind or the god of the earth, but the ideas of peace and harmony in the universe is really what's going to follow the Chinese through generation after generation, the idea of this type of philosophy, right? And we'll get into this a lot more when we get into the Warring States period and come out of the Warring States period, when we talk about the yin and the yang and Confucianism and things like that. So let's just introduce it right now. Now, we already know that one of the most important things about Chinese religion was the idea of ancestor veneration and making sure the ancestors were happy with the decisions of the family. Other than that, they have different gods. There was a creator god, Shangdi. He's the god presiding over the forces of nature. They had a name for the sun, which is Yang, a name for the moon, which is Yin, which eventually would become the Yin and the Yang, right, which we see here. This was all written down in a very early work in China called the Book of Changes. Now, here's the deal. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, so let me explain. This was part of society. This was understood by the ancient Chinese. They did not have to write this down, okay? This is something that just flowed through their lives, taught from parent to child, and kept going, kept going. Eventually, however, during the Warring States period, which we'll get to, people began to forget the traditions and the rituals of the religion, and therefore had to be reminded by writing it down in the Book of Changes, or the I Ching, right? Now, or the I Ching. Okay, so this symbol we are familiar with. This is the yin and the yang. The black represents coolness. The white represents hotness. And so the belief is that, and just very briefly, the belief is that everything in the world is juxtaposed against an opposite, right? Black is white, up is down, dark is light, boy is girl, that type of thing. And the universe works off that kind of a combination of opposites. And so what we see in the symbol of the yin and the yang is very common to that. It's not a straight line. It's fluid, and it flows and works with each other. And also, every light has a dark, and every dark has a light. And so it is a combination of opposites, even good and evil, that work together to create harmony in the universe. And when there is disharmony, it is because the balance is out of line, right? It's not because the evil is winning, it's because the balance is out of line. That's very different from Western philosophy, which we'll talk about at a little later date, okay? All right, we'll talk about the trigrams, which again talks about harmony and talks about fate. It's kind of like casting the bones. That's a little much for what we're doing now, so let's wait on that. All right, so the idea of the mandate of heaven. We discussed this in class, but let's go over it again. During the Zhou dynasty, the Zhou emperors overthrew the Shang emperors and ruled over the people. Some of the people were like, why are you ruling over us? What power do you have? What was wrong with the Shang? So the Zhou dynasty created the idea of the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is not something new. We saw Hammurabi receiving the scrolls from a god on the Hammurabi's code. We know that the Pharaoh was a god and gave laws. So all good things come from the gods. So the Zhou dynasty used that idea and said, hey, we are blessed by God, and therefore we are ruling over you. We have the mandate of heaven. So as the mandate of heaven, the Zhou rulers were the favorite son of heaven. They were the favorite people on earth. The gods liked them the most. The gods played favorites, and their favorite was the Zhou emperor, right? And so, how do you know? How do you know he had the mandate of heaven? How do you know he was the favorite? Well, you know he's the favorite because everything works well. The crops are great, and people are peaceful, and the taxes aren't too high, and there's no invasion, and everything is good. And why? Because the gods have blessed you, because the gods love your ruler. Here's the question. What happens if that starts to go south? What happens if there is an invasion? What happens if there's a plague and many people die? What happens if there's too much flooding, not enough flooding, and we have starvation, right? We have drownings from floods. Well, that means that the gods may have changed their mind about the favorite son of heaven, and he's not the favorite son of heaven anymore, and therefore you have a problem. Now, this was convenient for the early Zhou to say, look, the Shang dynasty, they were disliked by the gods, so the gods allowed them to be defeated by us, and therefore we are the kings, because the gods like us better, right? But what happens when things go wrong for the Zhou? Well, so the point of the king must rule in a way that the gods approve of, which means that he must have compassion and efficiency, and he must treat the people well. And if he doesn't, and things start to go bad, then he must be overthrown and replaced. And this is unique in the ancient world. We don't see this in Egypt or really in Mesopotamia, and we have revolutions in all places, and kings get overthrown all the time. But in China, we have a system set up that can be justified to overthrow a ruler. If the ruler is not ordained or loved by the gods, then that ruler has to go before things can get better, right? We're going to talk about that. So that is the mandate of heaven. Now, so let's go over. Let's go over how that cycle works. It's called the dynastic cycle in China. And so what we have here is we have a new dynasty is restored, let's say the Zhou, right? And the Zhou comes along and everything is good. What we're going to see at the beginning of dynastic periods, whether it be the Zhou or the Han or the Tang or the Sui or the Song, we're going to see the first rulers of the dynasty lower people's taxes and build roads and expand and make things right and make sure that they are liked. They have a real concern at the beginning of a dynasty that people like them. Why would they think that? Well, as you've already guessed, they want people to think they have the mandate of heaven. So they want everything to work well so nobody doubts that they have the mandate, right? Well, that's great. So they do that. But then after a few generations, bad things are going to happen. It's going to flood too much. It's not going to flood enough. People are going to invade. Disease is going to run rampant. So it's the ancient world. A lot of bad things would happen. Now, we know today that none of that stuff is the king's fault, really, unless it's maybe invasion and the king was sleeping, right? But back then, it was all the fault of the king. Any bad thing that happened, whether it be like too much rain, too little rain, a calf born with two heads, it's a bad sign, right? And so therefore, the king has to go. Think about it. You've got a king, and you've got an aristocratic class, and you've got peasants, right? Merchants and all those. Just throw them in one. Call them peasants. Now, who is yelling the loudest here when things start to go bad? If you said the aristocrats, you're right. Because what are the aristocrats wanting? The aristocrats want more power. What we see in feudalism, and that's what this is a struggle between the top two classes, the emperor and the aristocrats, right? If the emperor is strong, the nobles will behave. If the emperor is weak, then the nobles begin to rise up. And the weakness, and the nobles in China will use this weakness in the dynastic cycle and say to the people, oh, the gods don't love the king anymore. We should rise up and have a rebellion. And that's what happens. The aging dynasty loses the mandate of heaven, and then there is a rebellion. That rebellion comes along, led by the aristocrats, right? And they overthrow the old dynasty and establish a new dynasty. And guess what the new emperor has? the mandate of heaven. Conveniently, he has it. Right? Now, who is the new emperor? Well, he's usually the strongest noble. The strongest noble will claim himself emperor, starting a new dynasty, and therefore the cycle begins again. Now, this dynastic cycle continues for thousands of years, all the way up to the 20th century when the dynastic cycle ends and China enters the modern world, right? However, there's a little wrench in the plans here, and it sometimes happens, and it's going to happen at the end of the Zhou dynasty. We're going to get to this point when the emperor is overthrown, and there's no clear winner. There's no clear new emperor. So what do? Well, this is a problem, because the aristocrats, the nobles, begin to fight each other for power to see who is going to be the greatest so they can become emperor or at least expand their territory before a new emperor is named, right? And so this is what we call a warring states period. And a warring states period is chaotic for everyone because the nobles are fighting each other, the peasants have no protection because the warriors, the soldiers aren't protecting them, they're all fighting, so bandits run rampant, and it's really a sad time in any country's history. We're going to talk about a couple of different places where they go through what we call a warring states period. And at the end of the Zhou, this is what happens as well. All right, now the Zhou dynasty continued. During the Zhou dynasty, you have economic success, you have societal growth, agricultural advances. Again, China was amazing for technology. They came up with so many things before anyone else. So let's look at some things. The water control projects, they developed iron. We haven't talked about iron yet. We'll talk about iron at the end of certain river valley periods. But in China, they developed iron early on. Now, iron, really quick. Bronze was great, right? But bronze in China was mostly used for decorative things. So it's pretty, right? And sometimes they would use it for tools or weapons or things. But the problem with iron and bronze, it's too soft. Iron is harder. It's not as expensive. It's easier to find. So so that makes it cheaper. And you can sharpen it to a really sharp blade, and that blade does not dull as quick as bronze does. And so therefore, it's a great tool. And also, as you've already made the connection, it is a great weapon, right? So you have iron plows, natural fertilizer, a collar harness. And some of these things are like, was that really a significant invention in world history? Yeah, it was. The idea that you can harness an oxen or then allow that oxen to pull instead of you doing it by hand is going to allow farmers to plow so many more acres of land and produce so much more food, right? So an animal collar, a horse collar, an oxen collar, is going to be significant leaps in agricultural technology, right? Leaving land, follow cultivation of wet rice. Chinese learned early on that if you rotate crops and not just use the same land, you can grow more food and grow more. They began to grow rice and millet at the same time, and that allowed them to grow more food. And remember, more food equals more people, equals more food equals more people, and China's population began to grow much faster than other places in the world, right? And population growth. Okay, so trade and manufacturing occurred here, and again, at this point, the Zhou is just kind of trading around China, not necessarily international trade. And we saw international trade was going on between like Mesopotamia and Indus River, but China is so isolated by these deserts and mountains. But they have enough civilizations in northern China, and we'll talk about southern China, that allows them to trade and make lots of money just within China itself, domestic trade, right? So you have population boom, fed the growth of commerce and manufacturing. Early on, we began to develop the natural fiber known as silk, right, from the silkworms. And of course, silk is going to be the flagship of trade of China in the ancient world. What road is it? It's the Silk Road, right? And it's not just a clever name. Now, it was a closely kept Chinese secret for centuries. Westerners or foreigners who came to China always wondered how this silk was made. Was it a plant? You know, how was it done? Nobody ever told them it was caterpillars, right? Until much later they discovered it. And so China has a corner of the market of one of the most sought-after fabrics in the ancient world, which is silk. And that's going to make China very wealthy. Economic wealth replaced noble birth for power and influence. Now, this is interesting because we're going to study this cycle many, many times in history. And eventually, people with money will overtake people with title. And that's just the way the world is today. But in China, it begins to happen very early on. And the nobles feel threatened by these merchants with money. The nobles have power because the king gives them power, and their children have power because they're part of a noble family. I mean, it's all in the family, and family is very important in China, as we talked about. But the nobles always feel threatened by these people who have money but not really titles. And so early on, the nobles and the emperor will shove these people down to the bottom of the social ladder with the excuse that they don't even make anything. They just trade stuff. So merchants in China will be a very low class, even though they have lots of money and they have a lot of influence with the peasant class, they don't really break into the nobility class because the nobles feel threatened by them and will shove them down. And we'll talk about that even up until the imperial period in China, right? Okay, so the decline of the Zhou. Every dynasty declines, every empire declines, right? And the Zhou dynasty declines as well. What happens with the Zhou is the beginning of the smithing iron weapons, right? And iron weapons, of course, are more effective in warfare. And it seems kind of, okay, it's a little bit of a leap. No, it's a leap. I've heard historians talk about how the jump between bronze and iron weapons is a jump between like riding a horse and riding in a tank. And that seems a lot, right? But the iron weapon was just so much more effective in holding its edge and slicing and cutting that if you had iron weapons, then you were dominant. And eventually, of course, because of diffusion, all Chinese kingdoms would have these iron weapons. And with iron weapons, they would have large armies. And with large armies, they would start to fight each other. So warfare, in a nutshell, warfare is where it caused the Zhou dynasty to end. It begins in 771. Now, we haven't talked about the area above China, but we will a lot. And the area above China is not a settled or civilized or agricultural society. This area above China, known as Mongolia, that would give you a hint, is a place where nomads just kind of wander around and herd horses and sheep, right? Well, these nomads begin to invade into China and steal their stuff, just like we talked about that relationship between nomadic people and settled people is a relationship. It's kind of a love-hate relationship where they would trade with each other, but then the civilized people were always seen by the nomads as a very steady source of food. And these people would ride into China and raid and eventually ride back. Sometimes their numbers would be so great that they would just attack a dynasty and conquer it. This is essentially what happens with the Zhou. 771, the nomads invade China. The Zhou emperor is weak. No one comes to his aid because they kind of want him to fail. His capital of Hao is conquered, and they have to flee to a new capital of Luoyang. Right? From that point, the Zhou dynasty continues to decline, and it takes a couple hundred years, but they will continue to decline and eventually fall. As the Zhou emperor gets weaker and weaker, the nobles around him begin to rise up with their private armies and fight each other to try to gain more territory and even gain more land. Now, gain more power, maybe even become emperor. Now, this begins what we call, the idea of the dynastic cycle, a warring states period, or the spring and autumn period, sometimes called in Chinese history, right? Which lasts from 403 to 221. It's a 200-year period of war, right? And that's going to lead China into chaos and a little bit of de-civilization. The idea of civilization is that society always moves forward. But sometimes society will move backward in times of chaos and war and destruction. And when we pick up China next time, we'll look at how China had to come out of this darkness into a new age. Well, help with philosophy and also help with the powerful emperor of the Qin dynasty. So the Zhou finally falls around 221, and then a new dynasty will take its place shortly after that, which will be the Qin. Okay, now let's look south. As we said, China had two rivers, but we can't necessarily call it a two-river valley system because those two rivers are so far apart. And China is, of course, a massive territory, and this river is in the southern part of China. So we see the Huanghe, which is this little yellow stripe here, and then the Yangtze, which is here, right? Yangtze means long river in Chinese, and it was a massive river with thousands and millions of gallons of water every year that pour down and would flood over the banks and would come back. And so as we have civilizations in the north that are river valley floodplain harvest civilizations, we also have civilizations in the south that are floodplain harvest along the Yangtze River. All right, so southern states versus northern states. We have a large state in central southern China along the Yangtze River called the Chu dynasty. And the Chu dynasty combines different villages and towns around the same time as the Zhou. They will trade with the Zhou. They become rivals of the Zhou. They assert their independence from the Zhou as the Zhou weakens. And by the time the Zhou falls, one of the positive things that's happening during the Warring States period is that the southern kingdoms are trading with the northern kingdoms, associating with the northern kingdoms, and eventually adopting Chinese writing and Chinese beliefs and becoming Chinese. And so with the southern kingdoms and the northern kingdoms blending, you expand the territory of China greatly from the south to the north. Now these two rivers are going to have these two rivers are going to have somewhat of a relationship with each other, eventually going to be connected by a large man-made canal. But we'll see that later, right? So anyway, that's China. And if you have any questions, let me know. All right, till soon, guys.